At exactly 11:47 in the evening, every screen inside Mercer Dynamics headquarters went dark. A single line of red text materialized in the center of the main display inside the Executive Operations Center. Pay 50M or lose everything. Celeste Mercer, the company's CEO, stood motionless as the full weight of what had just happened pressed down on the room. The billion-dollar launch system locked down hours before a global product announcement that could define her company's future. Her cybersecurity team was already scrambling. Her lead investor was already dialing in from across the country. In the hallway just beyond the operations center door, Garrett Holloway, a single father working the overnight cleaning shift, quietly reached into the front pocket of his uniform and pulled out an old phone. Stay until the end, because the man everyone overlooked was the only one holding the key to saving everything. Mercer Dynamics had spent the better part of 3 years building toward a single night. The company's flagship product, Aurora Grid, an enterprise AI coordination platform designed to manage large-scale infrastructure decisions in real time, was scheduled for its global debut at a live demonstration event beginning at 9 o'clock the following morning. The guest list included procurement leads from some of the largest logistics and energy companies in the country. The first signed contract, already in final negotiation, was expected to land at $800 million. This was not a product launch. This was a coronation. The financial architecture surrounding the event was just as significant as the technology itself. Preston Shaw, one of the most closely watched private technology investors in the Pacific Northwest, had positioned himself to close a $300 million funding commitment contingent on a successful demonstration. Analysts watching the company had projected that a clean launch could push Mercer Dynamics' market valuation upward by $4 billion inside the first 48 hours. Every stakeholder with skin in the game understood the stakes clearly. Aurora Grid either performed flawlessly in front of the world or everything they had built together unraveled under the weight of its own ambition. Celeste Mercer walked the length of the operations center floor just after 11 that night, with the quiet authority of someone who had already rehearsed losing and refused to let the thought take hold. She paused at each workstation, exchanged brief words with each engineer still running pre-launch diagnostics, and did not betray even a flicker of the tension that had been building in her chest for days. Nolan Pierce, her director of cybersecurity, met her at the far end of the room and told her with complete confidence that the system's security architecture was, in his words, untouchable. She nodded. She did not entirely believe him. Marin Tate, the company's general counsel, had spent the past hour reviewing final data handling protocols with a team of compliance engineers. Any breach of the client test data loaded into Aurora Grid ahead of the demonstration would trigger liability exposure that made the contract revenue look modest by comparison. She reminded Nolan of this twice. He told her twice that it was not a problem. Down the hall, a small group of engineers sat in a windowless room running network latency tests, eating takeout, and trying not to think about what would happen if the system failed in front of a live audience. None of them noticed the man pushing a cleaning cart through the hallway on the 42nd floor. Garrett Holloway had been working the overnight shift at Mercer Dynamics for nearly 4 years, and in that time he had become as much a part of the building's background noise as the ventilation system. One young engineer, turning sharply out of a side corridor, walked directly into his mop bucket that evening, sloshing water across the polished floor. He looked at Garrett with the particular impatience of someone who believes their time is uniquely valuable, and asked whether he could possibly work somewhere less in the way during a critical period. Garrett apologized and stepped aside. He watched the engineer disappear, then turned to look at the network topology diagram on the wall-mounted screen inside the glass-walled conference room beside him. On the far edge of the diagram, half obscured by a column label, there was a small routing identifier that looked unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent years with the previous generation of the platform. Garrett recognized it immediately. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up his mop and kept walking. The clock in the operations center turned to 11:47. The lights flickered once, then twice. Every screen went black at the same moment, silently and all at once, the way a city loses power when something breaks at the source. The message appeared without preamble, rendered in sharp red text against the black background that had swallowed every monitor in the building. Pay $50 M or lose everything. Below it, a counter had already begun its descent, 6 hours in clean white digits, ticking steadily downward. A group calling themselves Black Lantern had gained access to the deployment architecture of Aurora Grid. The system's launch environment was locked. The test data loaded from participating clients was being held in an isolated partition they controlled. If payment was not received before the counter reached 0, they would publish the client data publicly and ensure the demonstration event collapsed before it began. The operations center became a different place in the space of about 40 seconds. Engineers who had been half asleep over diagnostic readouts were suddenly very awake. Nolan Pierce moved fast, crossing the room in long strides and pulling his security team into an immediate conference. His voice was controlled, but Celeste could hear the change in it. The slight compression of someone calculating how bad something actually was, while simultaneously trying to make it appear manageable. He issued rapid instructions and told Celeste with a confidence that had shifted from certainty to performance that they would have this under control within the hour. Celeste called an emergency session with her senior leadership team and reached outside legal counsel while the call was still connecting. Marin Tate appeared in the doorway within minutes, already running liability projections. She told Celeste that the potential exposure from a client data breach, regardless of whether any data was actually published, could exceed the ransom demand by a significant multiple. The reputational damage to a company in the process of closing its most important commercial relationships would be a category of loss that didn't fit neatly into any financial model she had available. Preston Shaw appeared on the large video conferencing screen at 12 minutes past midnight, his expression carrying the specific neutrality of someone who had not yet decided whether they were angry. He looked at the countdown clock, then at Celeste, and asked a single question with the flatness of someone already composing the terms of their exit: whether he was about to commit $300 million to a company that had just been taken hostage. Celeste told him they were responding to an active security incident. He told her he understood what that meant. The call did not end warmly. Garrett had not gone far. He was standing in the corridor outside the secondary server monitoring room when the alert sound reached him. Not the sharp digital alarm tone the building's current systems used, but a lower, 3-beat pulse he recognized from a different era entirely. It was the kind of sound that shouldn't exist anymore, from a protocol retired when the platform's second-generation architecture was rolled out years earlier. He stood still and listened to it cycle through twice. Then he walked to where a security guard was posted outside the operations center entrance and said, in a voice kept deliberately low, that the people inside might be looking at the wrong layer of the problem. The guard told him that whatever was happening inside was well above his involvement level, and used the phrase, "This isn't a mop situation," in a way that was probably not intended to be cruel, but landed that way regardless. Garrett did not argue. He reached into the front pocket of his uniform and wrapped his hand around the phone, its casing worn at the corners and its screen marked with a fine crack running from the upper right to the center. He looked at it for a moment without unlocking it. Then he walked toward the stairwell door at the end of the corridor and pushed it open. Garrett Holloway had been invisible inside Mercer Dynamics long enough that it no longer bothered him the way it once had. He was 44 years old, deliberate in his movements, and had arrived at a particular kind of peace with the gap between who he was and what people assumed when they saw the uniform. He had started at the company nearly 4 years ago, filling out paperwork for the overnight cleaning position at a metal folding table in the building's basement HR office. The pay was reliable, the health coverage was solid, and the shift, midnight to 7, meant he could be home when Tessa woke up and stay through the middle of the day without leaving her with a stranger. That had been the only consideration that mattered. Most of the staff knew him as Gary, which was not his name. He moved through the building's upper floors 5 nights a week without anyone registering him as someone who might understand the technical language on the whiteboards he passed, or the architecture diagrams in the glass-walled conference rooms, or the error logs visible on monitors left unlocked when engineers stepped away for coffee. He understood all of it. He simply had no reason to say so. The phone in his pocket was the last physical object he still carried from the years when his work had been different. He had kept it because replacing it felt like closing something he wasn't ready to close, and because it still held things that had no other copy in the world. There was an authentication application on it, an internal verification tool built in the early days of Mercer Dynamics' first platform architecture, tied to a device-specific credential he had helped design as part of the system's emergency recovery protocols. There were personal encrypted notes, a directory of technical contacts from the original platform's construction period, and a single audio recording from a project review meeting, captured on a quiet evening when Garrett had stayed late and suspected, correctly, that the conversation happening around him was one someone would later claim had not taken place. He had not kept the phone out of nostalgia. He kept it because there were promises that had been made and then unmade without explanation, and because the version of events that had ended his career at this company had never matched the version he had lived. His departure from Mercer Dynamics a decade earlier had not been a resignation. It had been a managed exit following a system failure that was not his fault, a failure he had warned about in writing, twice, before it occurred, and that he had been quietly assigned responsibility for in the aftermath anyway. He had not fought it. Fighting would have meant depositions and disclosures, and months of uncertainty, and Tessa had been 6 years old and had already lost her mother to a marriage that couldn't hold the weight of financial instability and professional collapse at the same time. He was at the end of the stairwell, sitting on the top step with the phone resting on his knee, when it rang. Tessa's name appeared on the cracked screen. She asked if he was going to make it back before she left for school. He told her he had a few things to finish up. She said, with the slightly exasperated affection of a 16-year-old who had learned to treat his night shifts as a running joke between them, that he had better not let them make him clean the whole building by himself. He told her that tonight, he might have to clean something bigger than the floor. She asked what that meant, He said he would explain in the morning. He ended the call, looked at the old phone for a long moment, and then unlocked the screen. The cracked display lit up, and in the corner of the home screen, the original Mercer Dynamics logo, the one the company had retired 9 years ago, glowed faintly in the dark of the stairwell. Getting back inside the operations center required a specific combination of insistence and patience that Garrett had more of than most people expected from a man in his position. He told the guard at the door that he needed to speak with either Nolan Pierce or Celeste Mercer. The guard said that was not possible. Garrett said the name of a network routing protocol aloud. A string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to the guard, but carried enough weight that it drifted through the glass and reached Nolan, who was standing 10 feet away with his back turned. Nolan turned around. He did not look pleased. He opened the door enough to speak through the gap, the way someone opens a door when they want to communicate that the conversation will be very short. Garrett was brought into the room under conditions made clear by the posture of everyone present. He was there to say something, it would be evaluated, and then he would be asked to leave. Celeste Mercer looked at him from across the central operations table with an expression that was precise and cold. She said, in a voice calibrated to signal that her patience was not on offer, that she was managing a $50 million extortion crisis, and that whatever maintenance concern had brought him to the door would need to wait. Someone near the back of the room made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a release of tension. Garrett did not react to it. He said that he did not believe the point of entry for the attack was in the platform's current security architecture. The pattern of what was happening, the specific alert sounds, the nature of the lockdown, the timing relative to the system's behavior, suggested the group had found a way in through a legacy connection layer that predated the current platform, an old testing corridor that had been part of the original infrastructure and should not have been reachable from the outside. Nolan said, with deliberate clarity, that the pathway Garrett was describing had been decommissioned years ago and was not a factor in the current situation. Garrett asked why, in that case, the server room on the 42nd floor was still cycling a 3-beat alert pattern from the legacy monitoring protocol. Nolan said the alert sounds were irrelevant artifacts from outdated hardware and did not indicate anything meaningful about the current attack surface. Celeste said, more directly, that her team were professionals and that Garrett was a janitor. She meant the word not as cruelty but as a category, a way of sorting him into a box that made his presence here a mistake she was correcting in real time. Garrett said nothing about the word. He looked at the countdown clock, 5 hours and 43 minutes remaining, and asked, quietly, what the current solution looked like. No one answered. The room held the particular silence that only exists when an uncomfortable question has been asked by someone who technically has no right to ask it. Preston Shaw, still on the video feed from the corner screen, asked in a conversational tone who the man in the cleaning uniform was. Celeste said he was a maintenance employee who believed he understood the system better than her security director. Shaw looked at Garrett without judgment, the way an investor looks at any unexpected variable. Garrett reached into his pocket and set the old phone on the edge of the operations table without saying anything else. The device sat there for 2 seconds. Then its screen lit up with a notification from the Legacy Authentication application, a small amber banner that read, "Legacy Access Attempt Detected." Nolan Pierce stared at it. Several people in the room took a step closer. Celeste Mercer's expression changed for the first time all night. The phone looked like something from a museum exhibit. Its manufacturer had discontinued the model line 8 years earlier. Its operating system was multiple generations behind the current standard, and the application open on its cracked screen bore the Mercer Dynamics logo from an era most people in the room had not witnessed. Nolan Pierce leaned over the table and looked at the device, the way someone looks at a problem that has appeared in a shape they weren't prepared for. He asked, with a precision trying to sound like skepticism, but beginning to sound like something else, why a decommissioned authentication application running on a decade-old personal device was receiving a live security notification. Garrett explained it at the level it needed to be explained. 10 years earlier, when the original Mercer Dynamics platform was being built, a small group of engineers had constructed an emergency recovery framework, a set of fallback systems designed to allow manual intervention if the primary architecture was ever compromised. As part of that framework, a handful of devices had been enrolled in a legacy authentication chain that would receive passive alerts if anyone attempted to access the old testing environment. When the platform was rebuilt and the old architecture formally retired, the assumption had been that the old testing environment was fully sealed off. The assumption, apparently, had not been verified. Garrett told them he had been one of the engineers who designed that notification chain. He said it because it was the fact that explained why his phone was receiving an alert that no one else in the room had seen. Nolan said there was no record of Garrett Holloway in the company's engineering personnel files. Garrett said that was correct. He had worked under a different role classification, on a project handled internally as a confidential infrastructure initiative. His name appeared in Project DAT documentation from that period, not in the public HR record. He unlocked the phone further and opened the personal note archive. He turned the screen toward Marin Tate and showed her a set of dated project entries, the name of the original platform architecture, the deployment date of the emergency recovery framework, and a flagged notation that read, "Legacy Test Gateway, do not reuse in new deployment. Physical isolation required at hardware level, not software level only." The entry was time-stamped from 9 years and 4 months ago. Marin looked at the screen without speaking. Then she looked at Nolan. She asked, in a tone that had become notably quieter, whether the current Aurora grid deployment had been built on the same physical server infrastructure as the original platform. Nolan said yes, but with full logical separation. The old environment had been partitioned off. Marin asked whether the physical isolation requirement noted in the original documentation had been implemented at the hardware level. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in that room, at that moment, was a very long time. Garrett said he wasn't there to assign blame. What mattered right now was that the notification on his phone indicated an active access attempt on the legacy testing environment, which meant Black Lantern was not using the front door of Aurora Grid's security architecture at all. They were using a side passage the current security team did not know was still connected. He said there was something else, and he said it carefully. The pattern of alerts suggested this access had not started at 11:47 that evening. It had started much earlier, possibly 36 hours earlier, which meant the attack had been staged from inside the operational perimeter before it was ever announced from the outside. Celeste Mercer looked at the countdown clock. 4 hours and 12 minutes. She looked at Garrett. She looked at Nolan, whose expression had taken on the quality of a man who knows that the conversation has moved past the point where he controls it. She did not ask Garrett to leave. She pulled out the chair across from him at the operations table and said that he could stay. Maren Tate was thorough. While Nolan's team ran diagnostics, she searched the historical personnel archive against Garrett's name and the project designations he had mentioned. What came back confirmed everything he had said and added detail that Celeste had not been prepared to receive. Garrett Holloway had been employed at Mercer Dynamics a decade ago as a senior recovery systems engineer, one of a team responsible for designing and implementing the emergency fallback architecture beneath the original platform. His personnel file from that period was marked as administratively closed, a designation meaning the separation had been managed quietly, and the record was not available in standard searches. The reason for the closure was listed in a 2-line notation referencing a critical system incident and a subsequent mutual agreement to close the employment record. Maren pulled the associated incident file. A major service disruption had occurred during a migration window on the original platform. In the aftermath, the incident had been attributed in internal communications to an engineering error, and the engineer named was Garrett Holloway. What the file also contained, buried in the appendix of an internal review document that had apparently never been acted upon, was a series of written warnings submitted by Garrett in the weeks before the incident. Clear, specific, technically grounded notifications to his direct supervisor and the project lead that the migration plan as written created a risk of exactly the failure that later occurred. The warnings were logged. They were acknowledged with brief replies. They were not acted upon. Celeste had not been at the company then. She had taken the CEO role 6 years later and had inherited the company's history without a complete inventory of its contents. She read Maren's summary and said nothing for a moment after she finished. Then she looked across the table at Garrett, who was sitting with his old phone in front of him and his hands folded, waiting without urgency for whatever came next. Preston Shaw, who had remained on the video feed throughout, asked in a measured voice whether the person currently advising them on how to defend their system was the same person whose advice this company had ignored the last time it found itself in a preventable crisis. Nobody answered him directly. Maren made a note in her legal pad. Nolan looked at the floor. Garrett did not look vindicated. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had set it down for a moment without being entirely sure whether it was safe to let go. He told Celeste that he did not need his old title back and did not need an apology tonight. What he needed was 20 minutes alone with the system map and someone from the infrastructure team who was willing to listen without deciding in advance that they already knew more than him. Celeste said he had it. Garrett made one thing clear before he began. He was not going to attack the attackers. He was not going to attempt to breach their infrastructure or disable their systems. What he was going to do was read the evidence that the company's own architectures had already been generating for the past day and a half. Evidence no one had recognized as evidence because no one had known what to look for. He said that the difference between a good defense and a bad one is usually not technology. It is the willingness to read what is already being written. He started with the alert timestamps on his phone and worked backward. The legacy authentication application had logged its first anomalous notification 36 hours and 14 minutes before the message had appeared on screen. This was a record of preparation. Someone, using access credentials connected to the old testing environment, had been probing the legacy architecture for more than a day before Black Lantern made its demand. He asked Nolan's team to run a log of all activation events for dormant accounts within the legacy environment, cross-referenced against the timeline his phone had recorded. The results came back in 11 minutes. There were 4 anomalous activations within the relevant window. 3 could be traced to automated system processes. The 4th could not. It had been triggered through an administrative account belonging to Dorian Blake, the company's vice president of infrastructure, who was, at that moment, in another city attending a technology conference. Marin immediately requested a cross-check of building access records. Dorian's physical access card had been used to enter the server maintenance corridor 2 evenings ago at 11:17 at night. The camera that normally covered the entrance to that corridor had experienced a logging failure during the relevant window. Garrett asked whether the building had any supplemental camera systems in that area, older installations, not necessarily integrated into the main security network. He asked this in the tone of someone who already suspected the answer, because he had been cleaning that floor for 4 years and knew every corner of it. He knew there was a small, older camera unit mounted at the interior junction of the maintenance corridor and the equipment room, a unit that predated the audit cycle, stored its footage locally on a physical drive in the building maintenance office, and had never been networked into the main system because no one had gotten around to it. The room's response had a specific quality that Garrett had encountered before. The particular silence of people realizing that the person they had written off had been paying attention to things they had never thought to look at. Garrett said, without satisfaction, "People who clean floors know which parts of a building are forgotten." The maintenance office footage was retrieved in under 20 minutes. It was low resolution, but it was clear enough. The timestamp matched. A figure entered the server equipment corridor using Dorian's access card at 11:19 in the evening, 2 nights prior. The figure was not Dorian Blake. It was Nolan Pierce. The operations center went very quiet. Nolan said that he had been running an infrastructure check in that area and had used Dorian's card because his own was showing intermittent reader errors. His voice was steady but had lost whatever had been holding it steady. Marin told him, with the careful neutrality of someone building a record, to step back from the operations console. Black Lantern sent a new message to the display. 3 hours left. Pay, or your launch becomes a funeral for your company. Garrett read it without urgency. He said that they did not only want the money. What they wanted was for this room to believe there was no road back. He looked at the people around him and said that was the only thing they were not going to give them. Nolan Pierce did not deny everything at once. He did it in the incremental, reluctant way of someone calculating how much revelation is going to be unavoidable anyway. He said he had not coordinated with Black Lantern, and he said he had not planned an extortion against his own company. He said these things with enough conviction that they were probably true. Then, under Marin's continued and patient questioning, the rest came forward. 3 weeks before the launch, he had contracted an external security firm, unlicensed, operating informally, composed largely of former penetration testers who had gone independent, to run a private assessment of Aurora Grid's defenses. He had done this without authorization from Celeste or the board. His reason, as he explained it, was that he had concerns about vulnerabilities in the legacy architecture layer and had not been confident in his own team's capacity to find them. He wanted an outside result he could bring to the table as evidence of his department's rigor before the launch, rather than reactive explanation after it. He had used Dorian Blake's credentials without Dorian's knowledge to grant the external team access to the legacy environment because he had not wanted the engagement logged under his own access record. The external group had gone further than agreed. He did not know exactly when he had lost visibility of what they were doing. He had assumed the estimate was concluding cleanly when the Black Lantern message appeared on screen, and he had understood, in the space of about 3 seconds, exactly what had happened. The group he had let in had decided that the access they had been given was worth more than the fee he had paid them. Celeste listened without speaking until he finished. Then she said, in a voice that was very controlled, that he had handed external actors unauthorized access to the infrastructure of the most important product the company had ever built, using credentials he had taken from a colleague for the purpose of making himself look good. Nolan said that was not how he would characterize it. Celeste said that was exactly how it was going to be characterized, and that Marin was already writing it down. She told him to step back from the room. Garrett's plan had 3 components. The first was isolation, severing the specific connection path the external group was using without triggering any data destruction mechanism positioned as a failsafe. This required working from the legacy recovery framework outward rather than from the current architecture inward, because the current architecture was the thing that had been compromised. The second was transfer, moving the Aurora grid deployment to a clean, offline recovery environment created as part of the original platform's emergency protocols and untouched by the current development cycle, which meant it was also untouched by anything Black Lantern had introduced. The third was preservation, keeping the compromised environment intact and isolated, not wiped, because it contained a complete record of everything done to it over the past 36 hours, and that record was going to matter to the investigators arriving in the morning. Celeste gave Garrett the operational authority he needed, under the direct oversight of Marin and 2 senior infrastructure engineers. Preston Shaw said simply that he was watching a company decide whether to pay $50 million to criminals or execute a recovery plan from a person they had, by all appearances, treated very badly, and that this observation was not a vote in either direction, only a plain statement of what was in front of them. Garrett looked around the room at the engineers, who would carry the plan forward, and said one thing before they began. They needed to stop assuming the worst about each other's knowledge for the next 90 minutes, because they did not have the time for it. The old phone lit up again. A new notification appeared in the authentication application's alert queue, recovery channel available. The execution of the plan was methodical and quiet in the way that real technical work tends to be. Not dramatic, not rapid, but precise and sequential, each step dependent on the one before it in ways that made rushing impossible. Garrett directed, the engineers executed, and Marin observed and documented in real time. The operation had the focused atmosphere of surgery, which it somewhat resembled in the sense that the most important discipline was knowing what not to touch. While the isolation sequence was being staged, a secondary access log produced one further detail. A user session record showed that the same administrative account used to re-enable the legacy testing endpoints had also accessed historical project files in the company's internal archive 40 hours before the Black Lantern message had appeared. The documents accessed were files associated with the original platform's emergency recovery protocols. The external group had known, before they announced themselves, exactly which recovery mechanisms existed and what their dependencies were. What they had not accounted for was the possibility that those mechanisms still had a registered authentication device sitting in someone's breast pocket. Garrett noted this without comment and told the team to continue. With 38 minutes left on the countdown, Black Lantern sent a final message. 1 hour. Final chance. The timestamp on the message was off. It had been queued and delayed, which suggested the group's access to the operations communication channel was already degrading. Garrett said that groups in full control of a situation do not send final warnings with timestamp errors. They send them on time because time is the only leverage they have. If the message was late, the leverage was already losing its shape. What Black Lantern needed now was the belief, still intact inside this room, that there was no other option. That belief was the real asset they were managing. He told the team to begin the transfer sequence and said they were not going to give them what they needed. The isolation of the compromised pathway was completed with 19 minutes remaining. The external group's access to the legacy environment was severed at the configuration level in a way that preserved all evidence in the compromised partition. The Aurora grid deployment transfer to the clean offline recovery environment took 11 minutes, moving the system state, the client test data, and the launch configuration package through the recovery channel in sequential verified blocks. With 6 minutes remaining on the countdown, the transfer completed. The clean recovery environment came online. Aurora grid initialized fully in the isolated deployment space, as if the events of the past 6 hours had been a weather event that had passed overhead without making landfall. The client test data was confirmed present and unaltered. The compromised legacy environment sat isolated and preserved behind a hard partition, all of its contents frozen for what would follow. The countdown clock reached 0. Nothing happened. No data was published. No systems collapsed. The room was completely silent for several seconds, the particular silence that follows a disaster that was prepared for and did not arrive. The main display shifted. The red text was gone. In its place, in clean white letters against the operations center's standard interface background, a single line appeared. Recovery complete. External control severed. Preston Shaw stood up from his chair on the video feed and said that he was still signing the investment commitment as a plain statement of a decision already made. Then he ended the call. Celeste Mercer looked at Garrett for a moment without speaking. She said, in a voice quieter than anything she had said all night, that he had just saved her company with a phone that looked like it belonged in a landfill. Garrett said that was not quite right. He said he had saved the company using something it had thrown away long before the phone, the knowledge of the people who had built the things that no one else could fix, the institutional memory of the engineers who had been made invisible and then forgotten, the work done carefully and without credit that had sat in the architecture, waiting for someone to remember it was there. He set the phone on the table, walked to the corner by the door, and picked up the mop he had left propped against the wall. The door opened. Von Mercer walked in, older than his photographs, moving carefully but steadily, his eyes scanning the room. His eyes found Garrett. He stopped. Von Mercer said his name the way people say the names of things they thought they had lost. He said, Garrett Holloway, with a pause before and after it, and the people in the room who did not know the name responded to the weight of it before they knew the reason for the weight. Vaughn said that he had been trying to locate Garrett for a number of years. He said that he had reviewed the files from the incident a decade ago, not the official record, but the internal documentation produced in an investigation that never went public, and that the picture those files contained was not the picture that had been presented to him at the time. His own health situation during that period had created gaps in his oversight that certain people had used to resolve a crisis in a way that required a sacrifice. Garrett had been the sacrifice they had chosen because he was the one who had been right. and being right in the wrong direction at the wrong moment was, in those environments, sometimes treated as its own kind of liability. Garrett listened without interrupting. He had imagined a version of this conversation many times over the years, not obsessively, not with bitterness, but in the way that people occasionally revisit the moments that changed the shape of their lives. What he had not fully anticipated was the listening itself. Standing in the room where it had all begun, a decade later, and having the man with the most authority in the company say plainly that it had not been his fault. Vaughn crossed the room and extended his hand, and Garrett shook it, and neither of them performed the moment for the benefit of anyone watching. Vaughn said that he was sorry. He said it as a complete sentence, without explanation or qualification, and Garrett received it the same way. Celeste said that the company had done something to this man that she had not known about, and that she needed to sit with that. Marin noted that the personnel documentation would need to be corrected, and that there were employment record implications to address through appropriate channels. Nolan would be escorted from the building within the hour, and would spend the weeks ahead explaining his decisions to investigators who were not interested in the narrative he had prepared. The evidence Marin had assembled would go to the appropriate authorities in the morning. Garrett said that he had not returned to the building to collect a debt. He had not spent 4 years cleaning the floors of a place that had wronged him as an act of quiet resentment. He had come back because the work was steady, because his daughter needed stability, and because there was a part of him that had wanted to understand what had happened here well enough that the understanding would eventually replace the need for anything else. That part was satisfied. What he needed now was something different. He said that if this company was going to extend him any kind of role going forward, he wanted one condition attached: that Mercer Dynamics create a formal development program for the employees in the building who occupied the roles that he had occupied. The maintenance workers, the overnight staff, the people in the service categories, to give them access to technical education and pathways into other roles, if they wanted them. Not because they all would want them, but because some of them would, and those people deserved to be asked, instead of being assumed into permanent invisibility. Celeste said yes before he had finished the last sentence. It was the first time all night she had agreed to anything without weighing it first. The global launch of Aurora Grid went forward at 9 o'clock the following morning, 5 hours behind its original scheduled window, but otherwise intact. Celeste Mercer stood at the podium in the demonstration hall and told the audience that the company had, overnight, successfully defended its platform against an external intrusion attempt using internal recovery protocols. She said that a member of her team had identified a vulnerability the company's primary security systems had not caught, and that his intervention had ensured the integrity of the launch and the safety of the client data. She used the word team deliberately and without hesitation, and she meant it in a way she had not always meant it when applied to people in certain roles. Preston Shaw signed the $300 million investment commitment that afternoon, without the renegotiation Celeste had quietly been preparing for. He told her that the story of how the system had been saved was going to be the most interesting thing about Mercer Dynamics for the foreseeable future, and that interesting stories, told correctly, were worth something balance sheets could not fully capture. She told him she would take that under advisement. Garrett drove home in the early morning light, the city still mostly quiet around him. He was tired in the specific way of someone who has been precise under pressure for a long time, the kind of tired that settles into the body slowly and completely and feels, in a strange way, like satisfaction. He found Tessa in the kitchen making cereal, still in her school clothes, her backpack by the door. She looked at him the way teenagers look at their parents when they know something happened, but are deciding whether to ask directly. He put the old phone on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. He said it still worked. She said she had never doubted it, in the affectionate tone of someone who had heard that phone, called a relic for most of her life, and had always quietly believed her father anyway. He sat down and they had breakfast together in the morning light, and he told her most of what had happened, leaving out the parts that would have kept her past her bus time. Several weeks later, Garrett accepted the role of part-time recovery systems consultant at Mercer Dynamics. He negotiated his hours carefully, 3 days a week, structured around Tessa's schedule, with no obligation to attend events that conflicted with the parts of his life the work was meant to support rather than replace. The Mercer Dynamics Technical Development Program for service staff was announced in the company's internal communications 6 weeks after the launch. 14 employees enrolled in the first cohort. Garrett wrote the welcome letter for the program. He kept it short. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into his consultancy, Garrett was walking through the 42nd floor when Celeste Mercer came the other way down the corridor. She stopped before she reached him, which was something she had never done before. She said good morning, and she said his name, all of it, the right name, the full name, in the way that saying a person's correct name is a small act of return. He said good morning back. He said her name in the same register, equal and quiet. The way two people speak when the distance between them has finally been measured honestly. That night, Black Lantern had believed they were dealing with a building full of people who did not know what they had. They had studied the architecture, mapped the access points, researched the recovery mechanisms, and accounted for every possible response they could imagine. What they had not imagined was a single father on the night shift who had built the foundation they were standing on, who had been carrying its memory in a cracked phone in his breast pocket for 10 years, waiting not for revenge, not for recognition, but for the one night when the door that everyone else had forgotten about would be the only door that mattered.